Jinhsi is insane. She tops all the damage charts right now, and besides Jian, no one really compares to how much potential she has. Today we're gonna figure out the 3 best teams for Jinhsi, why you should build each, and what the strengths and weaknesses of each are. Let's get into it. Now before I reveal the teams, a small note. Most, if not all, these teams will have Verina. This is a best teams video, not a potential teams video. However, I do want to mention that if you want to replace her with someone like Baizhi, I have good news for you. Something that I think is fairly misunderstood and not really explained too well is the fact that Baizhi's outro skill can actually be prolonged. If you take a look at the skill itself, it says heal the incoming resonator by 1.54% of Baizhi's max health every 3 seconds for 30 seconds. The healed resonator has their damage amplified by 15% for 6 seconds. What it doesn't say here is that this damage amplification is actually continued so long as the healing keeps coming out. So in other words, the actual length of this skill, at least from what I understand, is actually much longer, and therefore Baizhi is not actually as bad as people make her out to be, though she does feel a little bit clunky, and it does take a little while to get her outro skill. To be clear, she is definitely still worse than Verina, but I wanted to make this PSA. Let's get back into it. The first team that we have is Mortefi, Verina, and Jinhsi. A couple notes about this team comp before we get into it. Mortefi is a resonance liberation damage focused character who has coordinated attacks, increases heavy attack damage, and is also fairly concerto efficient. Verina, who again will be in all of these teams, is the best support and healer in the game while providing your team damage amplification and another coordinated attack. And finally, we all know about Jinhsi. She's the main damage dealer. She does resonance skill damage. Cool. Now, as you can see, the team revolves around a lot of swapping, making sure to make use of Verina, and honestly just abusing a lot of the coordinated attacks. Now let's talk strengths for the Mortefi, Verina, and Jinhsi team. One of the things that I think is the strongest thing about this composition is that if you were someone that decided to pull for Jian or have, for whatever reason, several sequences for Mortefi, it does mean that you have a very strong coordinated attack, high burst, sub DPS that you can pair alongside your Jinhsi. In this sort of composition, every single hit that you do, whether it's from Verina, whether it's from Mortefi, whether it's from Jinhsi, all do a lot of damage, and it contributes to an extremely consistent and very fast composition that allows you to get your outro skill, allows Jinhsi to get as many incandescent stacks as possible, and makes her an absolute powerhouse. As you can see here with my build as well, which I'll show at the end, I'm doing well over 200,000 on a crit, and I don't have any sequences in my character, nor do I have anything outside of just her signature weapon, which I understand does make her a little bit stronger. However, with the composition that you're looking at here, now there are some other strengths that I need to mention when it comes to this team composition, and it's the fact that honestly, you can play this a lot of different ways. Mortefi is an extremely versatile, very flexible character that you can kind of bob and weave in between characters to not only make use of their echoes or cooldowns, you don't have to really stay set to one rotation. Since Mortefi's coordinated attack works with whoever you're on, you can basically swap between characters, get an extra Jue cast, get an extra skill cast from Jinhsi, even before you actually get into a rotation, and all these things will only contribute to an even higher potential damage output when it comes to Jinhsi. All in all, this team composition performed really well, and as you can see on the screen right here, we ended up clocking in at around 3 minutes and 30 seconds for a clear on the Heron, which is the last boss of the Spectro-specific tower for Tower of Adversity. But now we have to talk about weaknesses, because there definitely are quite a few. Number one, if you are someone that is very familiar with or prefers to play parry compositions, this feels a little bit weirder. Most of your parries in this composition, outside of the rare Jinhsi parry once she gets onto a rotation, is mostly going to have to come from Verina. Parrying with a pistol is quite difficult, and if that's something that you're familiar with, okay. However, dodging does feel pretty good, though it doesn't feel that good to dodge with Mortefi when it feels like sometimes you're in the air or you're sometimes in the sky, and you don't have a way to plunge attack and drop straight to the ground. You just shoot and fall slowly. Now, the other thing that I kind of mentioned earlier that I think is kind of a problem, but I don't think is quite as mentioned, is that if you don't have any sequences in Mortefi, he actually performs quite poorly with this team composition. In addition to having an absolutely ridiculous load of sequences, including an attack increase and an S5 that actually goes crazy, there's a team composition that I'm going to be mentioning later that if you don't end up having Mortefi for, will actually make him seem so much worse compared to the alternatives. But back to the video. As you can see here, again, most of the time when you do have someone like Mortefi on the field, he is going to be utilizing your sub DPS or acts as a sub DPS slot, And unlike someone like Yinlin, or if you're using a true hyper carry composition where you have extended 10, maybe even 15-second rotations of having someone like Jian purely on field and doing as much damage as possible, Jinhsi's rotations are extremely short. They're roughly between 7 and 9 seconds depending on how slow you are or what ends up happening in a fight. But because you have a character that swaps off quite consistently, you'll actually see a lot more usage for Mortefi. So if you are someone that has actually been spending a lot less time investing in Mortefi himself, this is also a major flaw. If your Mortefi is very weak and he doesn't do that much damage, guess what? His damage is going to reflect that. Now, you've seen this clear and you've seen about how much damage I do in this video. What if I actually told you that I was missing both of my attack percent echoes as this was going on? Yeah, that's not really a weakness. That's kind of like a brain dent kind of thing for me, but I was still able to clear the fight in roughly 3 minutes and 30 seconds, which I think is pretty cool. Now, on the topic of builds, if you're curious about what I was running during that fight and why I was only doing something like 300 damage per shot, well, this is what my build looked like prior to it. That's right, I had 1100 attack, 40 crit rate, and 182 crit damage, which is still kind of respectable in terms of investment, but I did actually invest in my Mortefi more because I was needing him for clearing Jian floors much more, especially as I was trying to challenge more of the tougher floors. In reality, his build looks closer to something like this, which doesn't seem like a huge amount of increases. I'm just missing 2 echoes, but it does give me about 350 attack, which is about a 20 to 30% damage increase, and I was also given about 20 crit rate alongside around 16 crit damage, which is pretty significant and does quite a bit for me. Now, in terms of when I'd use this composition, there's a couple reasons for why you might want to build the Mortefi, Verina, and Jinhsi team. Number one, if you've already pulled for Jian, maybe didn't get Jian, and ended up getting Mortefi copies in the process, or if you feel like using Jinhsi instead of Jian, and you feel like Mortefi and his coordinated attacks will actually benefit Jinhsi more than you would want to play him with Jian. To be clear, getting rid of Mortefi alongside Jian is a damage loss to the Jian-Mortefi composition and Jian's potential in general. However, for Jian, you could always argue that using someone like Altu is possible, though Mortefi is definitely his best in slot partner. For most other reasons, if you're just familiar with or want to play someone that's a bit more ranged and has a bit more flexibility in their composition, I do think that Mortefi has a lot of strengths. Some of the other teams that I'll be mentioning later in this video, stay tuned for that, actually do suffer sometimes in terms of reach or being able to hit an enemy that flies away, which is not so much an issue when Mortefi is, again, shooting from far away. Even if the enemy is, like, you know, flying in, Mortefi still has the ability to hit from range, though the actual benefits of this may not be that incredible as opposed to just lining up your rotation and waiting for the enemy to fall down. At the end of it all though, I do think that Mortefi is quite strong. He's arguably a character that you've likely already invested in if you're someone that played Jian, and in terms of his actual raw damage output, he's one of the best non-5-star non-main DPS carries that you can actually add to your team to contribute as a hybrid DPS. Side note, if you are someone that's been farming for something like Yinlin, he also has the benefit of sharing a couple of her echoes, because if you're running something like Moonlit Cloud, well, the only 2 things that you need to change are something like the 3 cost echoes, even less if you decided to run attack percent on Yinlin. You may be able to just swap the gear around should you have decided to pull for Yinlin and build her on Moonlit Clouds. As a final note, in terms of his weapon, I will say that there are some arguments to be made about how good or how bad some of the weapons are. I've seen a couple people say that something like Novaverse can be good. I've seen people say that restoring his Concerto energy with Cadenza is fine as well. But in truth, Mortefi does do very respectable damage himself, and through my build, you can see that I have invested in him a little bit. You can't see it, but my intro skill has, I mean, well, it's level 2, but I don't really think the intro skill is that important. But you can tell that I've invested at least a little bit into this character, because I do think that Jian Mortefi is absolutely crazy in terms of damage potential. However, what this ultimately means is that although Mortefi is quite good, although he has a lot of pros, he is a character that needs investment and isn't super low budget, though you do gain the ability to play more flexibly. And if you already have this character built because of Jian, well, look no further than the next insane team composition that you can use with him, especially if you like the ranged playstyle. Now let's talk about the actual strongest, statistically, mathematically, spreadsheetily, the strongest team when it comes to Jinhsi, and that's Yinlin, Verina, Jinhsi. Let's take a look at what Yinlin offers as opposed to Mortefi. Number one, as you can see even from her labels, she's Concerto efficient, she does a lot of resonance skill damage, she has coordinated attacks, she amplifies electro damage, and she also amplifies Resonance Liberations. To be clear, the Resonance Liberation does already apply and can be used by Jinhsi as opposed to the heavy attack from Mortefi, as opposed to the heavy attack damage amplification for Mortefi. So therefore, this character does have a little bit more value, though she isn't still quite perfect since Jinhsi isn't actually able to make use of the electro damage amplification. Regardless, Yinlin, as most of you guys probably know by this point, is an absolute damage powerhouse. She does so much damage, in fact, that some people consider her to be a main DPS herself, which is kind of cope, but we can all agree that her damage is quite ridiculous. Now, for the sake of consistency, I actually ended up fighting the exact same boss with Jinhsi and Yinlin to see just how much damage I could do, and while this goes on, let's talk about the strength of Yinlin. She is very much loaded in terms of damage, and that's, for the most part, the reason why people will end up taking someone like Jinhsi as opposed to Mortefi. Now, both of them are technically off-field DPS that are rewarded more, mostly because you get to stay on field with someone like Jinhsi more frequently. However, what you'll notice with Jinhsi and Yinlin together is the fact that they both kind of take a lot of hits and they aren't that great at parrying. If you're fighting a boss that actually ends up doing a lot more damage to you and ends up needing you to parry a bit more or has attacks that you need to cancel with parrying, it'll probably be a little bit more difficult for you when it comes to Jinhsi and Yinlin, since you're going to have to do things like plunging attacks, timing the second E of Yinlin, or have to be on Jinhsi during her damage period where you're trying to nuke and do a bunch of damage, instead of just doing something simple like a Jian auto attack, maybe doing something like a Calcharo hit, etc, etc. Now, that does kind of come with a couple pros and cons to it, and right here, as you can see, I did kind of grief a little bit by taking a bit more time to kill, and in this case, I probably could have just gotten to my Jinhsi phase a little bit faster, but as you can see on screen, I'm actually clearing about 20 or so seconds faster, which is crazy. I cleared this fight in about 3 minutes and 48 seconds, which is about 20 seconds faster than the Mortefi composition, though of course in the clip that I just showed you with Mortefi, he literally didn't have attack echoes on. Now, there's a lot of variance in RNG to each fight, how often you crit and things like that, but let's be clear, if you were someone that decided to skip for Jian, you probably have Yinlin. If you're sick and tired of having to pair Yinlin alongside Calcharo because maybe he's not a waifu or maybe because he's a little bit hard to play, well, now you actually have a proper partner in crime with Jinhsi. They both have coordinated attacks, they both kind of complement each other with how frequently they can be on and off field. Jinhsi gives Yinlin a free intro, by the way, if you decide to play her that way, though I myself in this clip was using Jinhsi alongside Verina to gain more energy. Another really big thing that people don't talk about is that the free outro from Jinhsi means that if you are using someone like Jinhsi alongside Yinlin, you could just give her a free intro, you can make her do more damage, and inevitably she'll get to her ultimate even faster. But something that I want to touch on for why Yinlin feels the best when it comes to Jinhsi is because the actual burst potential, whether that's in multi-enemy fights or if that's in single target fights, regardless of what kind of encounter you're in, the two of them perform extremely well. Now, something that I want to bring up is that although I did do a couple of fights here, specifically on the Heron to demonstrate how much damage each does, I also ended up doing tests against the Gorilla, and as you can see here, there are some instances where, unfortunately, you're going to have to fight against multiple enemies. Now, to be clear, when I did this with Jinhsi and Yinlin, it took me about maybe 2 or 3 tries to basically beat the boss and get 3 stars on it. However, if you couldn't tell by the length of this VOD, it is quite lengthy, and even despite showing you 3 fights now at this point on the same VOD, the video is still really long, and that's because of how long it took for me to line up Mortefi, Jinhsi, and Verina together so that I could actually clear the first wave quickly. But Connor, you may be asking, why don't you just take someone like Zhangjin, or why don't you take someone like Yang Yang instead of Verina? Well, that's a good point, but that's not the point in this video. However, I do want to mention that, again, even if you want to take someone like Zhangjin alongside someone like Encore Sanhua for a separate team, Yinlin and Jinhsi themselves are almost duoable, and you almost don't even need a third character in general, which I think adds to the benefit of taking these two together by a metric ton. Now, I do want to bring up Tower of Adversity for a second, but before we get into that, the reason why you're seeing 0 out of, everything and I don't have any, stars right now is because I claimed them all and I was doing testing, so I reset them all, but I ended up 30 starring it, just so you don't think that I've not cleared any of the content and I just magically cleared all the content or it's bugged. That's what's going on. But But if you take a look at the Tower of Adversity, and to kind of piggyback off of what I was mentioning about saving energy or being more flexible and being able to be used as just a duo instead of a trio, you actually need to be quite smart about how you end up building teams when it comes to Tower of Adversity. And especially if you don't want to have to build 3 whole separate DPS teams, you can actually mix and match certain characters, or if you have certain characters built but you don't have supports to complement them, you can actually clear the first 2 stages of both of these towers just a single character, which makes saving Zhangjin from having to be put in when fighting against the monkey actually worthwhile, and is yet another pro for Jinhsi and Yinlin. However, not all is perfect about the combo. Let's actually talk about their weaknesses. While I definitely don't consider the accessibility of a character a weakness when I'm talking about the best teams to pair with a character, it is worth mentioning that there just are 2 limiteds and a Verina on screen right now. Is this a big weakness as opposed to something that you just need to keep in mind if you are trying to play the composition? Yes. Is this a weakness as opposed to something that you need to just keep in mind? No, but it still does feel a little bit bad when you see it on screen. Now, in terms of actual weaknesses, something that I will say, and I've mentioned a little bit earlier, is that when you have these characters, they feel like they're just flies that are getting swatted out of the sky by both the monkey, by the Ikes, pretty much any character you look at. It feels like you are unsafe 24/7 when it comes to these characters. Now, while that might be a skill issue, and lots of you may argue that, oh, well, just don't get hit, learn the attack pattern, it is very, very difficult in some cases to dodge, predict certain encounters, or even know what the boss is about to do when the camera is the 3rd boss that you have to fight at the exact same time. To be clear, certain bosses are definitely telegraphed. The monkey and the heron are definitely not the worst offenders of the camera abusing. However, it is super, super prevalent, especially when you start to fight certain enemies like Tempest Mephis that teleports behind you, maybe jumps on top of you like you aren't locked in or you may have unlocked for a second, and then the boss teleports behind you and shoots you in the head. It feels very, very annoying to try and play Jinhsi and Yinlin because most of their hits are not things that auto lock on. You have to be within a certain range for their hits to actually apply and make sense, which is a little bit different compared to the next character we're going to talk about, and also Mortefi, who again pretty much has infinite range because his shots just fly across the map. Now, I'll be straightforward with you as well. There really aren't that many weaknesses specifically for Jinhsi Yinlin. However, I do think that the strength of these 2 characters are definitely carried a lot by also having an insanely strong pairing of not just having their signature weapons, but also having a very cracked out set of DPS. I'll show you my build for my Yinlin later, which you'll see is quite good and why I think she definitely performed much higher than Mortefi in this case. And now ultimately what I do want to say is that most, if not all, of the weaknesses when it comes to Yinlin and Jinhsi mostly come down to not getting hit or it being a little bit harder to play, which again is a skill issue ultimately. And again, it makes sense because this is just the best team in the entire game, and therefore the actual weaknesses are very far and few, if not pretty much ignorable, so long as you're playing like a human being. And as you can see from this fight, I was actually able to 3-star the monkey, even with a very, very annoying initial starting phase where I have to beat up the 3 mobs or beat up the golems and the little fission Junrocks, which is very annoying, by the way, when I don't have Zhangjin or any vacuum. On a final note, if you're curious what you have to do in order to clear this stage as Mortefi, I'll let the clips speak for themselves because it does not feel good trying to corral all the enemies together. I mean, like, look at this. Half the enemies are not going to get hit. Half of them are off to the side. They're not even all being hit by Yinlin's. They're not even being hit by an AoE. Even if I end up killing this rock here, I still have to deal with, like, look at the timer. It's 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Like, this is a terrible feeling. You hate to see it, and I'm sure you've experienced this well. Let's talk build. Now, Yinlin, of course, is an absolutely spectacular damage dealer, and of course, she also does buff Jinhsi's damage with her outro effect. My Jinhsi has a decent amount of energy, has good crit rate and crit damage, and also has solid attack. She does also have String Master, which is solid. And in terms of my investment into the character, I have level 6 in pretty much everything, but I invested in level 8 for a Forte circuit. Now, you've probably noticed that the difference between Yinlin and Mortefi is actually not that high when it comes to comparing the DPS in a single target instance. But keep in mind that Mortefi is S6, and the testing that I did for Yinlin involves no sequences whatsoever. Now, when it comes to the build that I have between Yinlin and Mortefi, of course, the difference is going to look a little different, especially as I need to literally take some of Yinlin's pieces to make Mortefi. But the truth is that Yinlin, especially when played perfectly and with a perfect rotation, is going to outpace Mortefi in so many cases because she's the limited, they want her to be strong, and her on-field time can be kind of short, especially if all you're doing is throwing out your skill, getting out your Ultra skill, getting out a Forte circuit, and then immediately swapping to your next character. The reason for why you would pick Yinlin over Mortefi is pretty much as follows. If there's an AoE encounter and you feel that you need to hit multiple enemies at once, and you still have a very close damage check that you have to adhere to, play someone like Yinlin. Mortefi's AoE does not perform very well, whereas Yinlin is definitely serviceable through her skill, through her ultimate, and her Forte circuit. Alternatively, if you ever end up fighting someone that is fire resistant, we haven't seen that in the tower quite yet, but if that ever ends up being the case, you may also find that Mortefi doesn't find as much use. However, you could argue that someone like Yinlin can't be used against the Tempest Mephis. So if you need AoE, if you need to do a lot of damage, and if you've invested in someone like Yinlin, feel free to take her. This team does the highest amount of damage possible, which is absolutely ridiculous. But let's move on to what I consider to be the best team for a different reason. Never in a million years would I have expected to say this, but Yuanwu is actually the GOAT when it comes to playing Jinhsi. Now, I tested this on stream. A couple of you guys may have seen this as well, but some people were asking what the best budget or what honestly the easiest to play Jinhsi team composition is. Mortefi and Yinlin do require you to swap to other characters. There's some animation cancels that you could do. Sometimes it feels like it's a little unsafe to play these other characters. But what about Yuanwu? We'll take a look at what Yuanwu has to offer. He has a coordinated attack, concerto efficiency, which pretty much everyone that's a support just does at this point. He has interruption resistance boost, and he also has vibration strength reduction. Vibration strength reduction, by the way, is the exhaustion bar. It's a little white bar that appears under the boss, and he does contribute quite a bit to trying to get rid of that bar or exhaust the boss and make them stationary and not able to move. But now let's take a look, because to be honest, Yuanwu is actually super slept on, and he's quite good at what he does. You basically have to spend no time at all when playing him. You just put down his pillar, you use your echo, and you immediately swap to Jinhsi and Verina. In all honesty, this composition feels more like a Jinhsi and Verina composition featuring the little lightning pillar that you're seeing on the side more than Yuanwu actually exists. But the damage is absolutely impeccable. It's so easy to play. You almost never really even have to swap to Yuanwu that much at all. You're pretty much just swapping between Verina and Jinhsi constantly to do a bunch of damage. You'll be surprised because one of the major strengths when it comes to this character is that you don't have to play another clunky character. Sometimes it feels good to play Jinhsi, but as I mentioned earlier, having to maybe juggle between characters leads you to sometimes being in an intro skill, sometimes you get hit as you're mid-transition and you're in the sky, but that isn't really the case when all you have to bounce between is Verina, who has an attack on their intro that can parry, and Jinhsi, who of course is your damage dealer. As you can see here though, all I'm doing is throwing out my ultimate, using my skill, using my echo, and then immediately swapping off of Yuanwu because I don't want to play that character anymore. But Connor, you may be asking yourself, how much damage are you doing? Are you ending with full Forte circuits? And the answer to that is sometimes no. However, with how frequently and how easy it is to bounce between Jinhsi and Verina, instead of filling up your Forte bar every single time, in some cases, all that will end up happening is you'll just ult more frequently, and instead of having to build another character like Yinlin or Mortefi, you could actually just use this with a low, no investment Yuanwu whatsoever. Now, I do want to preface that though the investment thing is definitely a major win for those of you looking to play this composition, to be fair to the last compositions that we talked about, investment may not always be the biggest factor to consider when it comes to the strength of the team. In this case, I actually think that how simplistic or how straightforward the composition is, in terms of a beginner-friendly, something that most people will have, this is bar none one of the strongest team compositions that you could argue to build. It feels extremely reminiscent to what people were saying about Gian Mortefi when Gian first came out. If you haven't tried this team composition, I highly recommend you do so. But before you do that, let's talk about the weaknesses of this composition. And that's that you're pretty much, again, forced to do all your dodging with someone like Verina and Jinhsi, or if you aren't familiar with, can definitely feel a little bit daunting. Another major thing that you may end up feeling bad about when it comes to Yuanwu and Jinhsi is that building him Unlike the others where it's like, yeah, well, I can invest in, or I already had the gear for these characters, Yuanwu and building his echoes is a special exception that I'd like to make a notice about, because the honest truth is that trying to build defense percent and rolling defense percent and trying to actually make him do damage is ridiculous. This team composition, of course, does perform well when Yuanwu has all of his upgrades, but that does also mean that you have to level him to 70 so that he gets his inherent skill, which makes this team composition even easier to play. Now, I bet you were probably going to expect another weakness or something else towards, oh, well, he doesn't do damage, or, oh, well, is he hard to dodge with? The answer is no. There pretty much aren't that many weaknesses when it comes to this composition, because you're spending so much of your time on Jinhsi that you don't really notice it. Any time that you have spent on Jinhsi is pretty much instantly getting off your intro skill, entering into the floating state so that you can get off your big dragon nuke puke skill, and then bada bing bada boom, you get a clear. Now, I want to talk about his build because the truth is that he doesn't really need anything to function. If you just take a look at his stats, you could tell this character has absolutely no investment in him. He's level 40. He's got a little bit of energy regen, but honestly, that didn't even matter either. His weapon is the Originite Type 4, which does allow me to activate his Rejuvenating Glow set, which is what I end up using on him. But honestly, outside of just having double energy regen and having the turtle so I can activate him as a damage increase and damage decrease taken by Jinhsi, he doesn't have anything invested in him. Him being at S6 does have a couple of advantages, including things like gaining additional resonance energy, providing a shield to your team, and also giving more defense to your allies. But in truth, this is the most budget team that you will ever use for Jinhsi, while also outperforming most Mortefi builds that aren't near or at max sequence, and just falling a little bit short of Yinlin, who of course is a character that you can invest in. But if you don't have her, this is the next best choice. I sincerely ask that if you are someone that really enjoys Jinhsi, and you definitely prefer just playing Jinhsi main field the same way that a lot of people like playing Jian alongside Mortefi, try this team out. They feel extremely similar with how often you're on field with Jinhsi and how infrequently you ever even have to see Yuanwu. The damage is crazy. The potential is there, and I haven't even talked about the best part about this character, which is that he can be taken anywhere. I neglected to show this in the showcase because at the time I wasn't sure if it would even work. I'm using Yuanwu in very low quality. I apologize because I'm ripping this literally straight from my VOD. I was doing this fight with Jinhsi alongside Yuanwu against Tempest Mephis, who is lightning. Now, obviously, my Yuanwu isn't doing much lightning damage at all, which means that his actual damage contribution doesn't matter. But this is a huge major win because characters like Yinlin and even Mortefi would actually struggle quite a bit if you're trying to fight against someone is taking half the damage all the time. In this scenario, as you're seeing, my damage potential is maybe not as high. In some of the Jinhsi fights alongside Yinlin, I was doing something like 230, maybe even like 290,000 damage, which was really cool. But specifically for Yuanwu, though I'm only doing something like maybe 130 to maybe 150,000 damage, I was actually able to clear in a similar time to my Mortefi, who was the only character I could showcase against this because Yinlin obviously is lightning and can't fight this boss. But I was still able to clear this fight in over 3 minutes and 30 seconds-ish, which is absolutely crazy. I wasn't really hard focused. I was literally talking to chat, as you can see it flying above me. Having a team that basically doesn't care at all about elements, and by the way, the time on this gets like a little bit increased because I'm literally fighting against the stupid Mephis buffs. But having a DPS that doesn't really care about what the element is, as a sub DPS specifically, actually provides really, really good value because so long as my Jinhsi can deal damage, well, it doesn't matter what Yuanwu does. It doesn't matter what my Verina does. I'm still going to clear in over 3 minutes and 45 seconds and get 3 stars. Now, at the end of it all, guys, whatever you choose to play when it comes to these teams is totally fine. This was more of a showcase, and I just wanted to show what I found to be the 3 strongest teams. A special mention should be made to Taoqi as a potential support option. However, something that I've seen a lot of people try to cook up is actually Taoqi specifically as a secondary DPS in the same kind of slot that someone like Yinlin was being used. But the honest truth is that Taoqi is quite difficult to play because you want to get her Forte Circuit off, you want to get her Resonance Liberation, and you want to get her Ultra Skill off, all while having one of the most wonky and finicky rotations of all time. I do want to make a special shout out to Meigi, who's actually doing some calcs on Taoqi, and although you can do a higher peak of damage, however, the actual damage per second result is much, much worse, specifically because of how long it takes for Taoqi to do her rotation, and that was including an extremely fine-tuned rotation from Taoqi that involves weaving her 2 or 3 times before you actually even get to use Jinhsi's damage rotation. In any case, guys, I do think that Taoqi is an option that you could have used here. However, in terms of versatility, in terms of overall use, in terms of not needing to build a defense percent character on a supportive set, I think that Verina is arguably in most cases going to perform at the highest peaks. And the other characters that I've shown you here, whether that's Mortefi, Yinlin, or Yuanwu, all perform extremely well, specifically because they do insane amounts of damage, they're easier to play, or they have insane damage potential higher than anything else in the game. Again, whatever you choose to play is totally fine. I just wanted to showcase these couple teams and why they're so strong. Take a look at what my character looks like. She has 128 energy regen, she's got 60 crit rate, 250 crit damage. She does have a decent amount of attack, rocking 2300 attack, and she does have her own weapon, though I have not used any of her sequences despite you seeing a little notification for it here. I will make a follow-up video showing just how much damage I'm doing with some of the characters and kind of taking a look at how good S0 versus S2 is. But in terms of my echoes, I'm running an attack percent alongside a spectro damage one, which is why my attack ends up being at 2300. In terms of investment for my skills, I have level 8 in my Forte circuit. You can't see it here, but I have level 6 in my Resonance Liberation, and I have level 6 in my Resonance skill alongside 6 in my normal attack. My intro skill is also leveled, but I actually didn't end up upgrading or taking this inherent skill yet because it takes weekly materials, and increasing the damage multiplier of my intro, even by 50%, is kind of weird because your damage share is extremely low when it comes to intro skill, though I know that at some point I'll eventually upgrade that anyways. And now finally for my Verina, she's pretty straightforward. She has 200 energy regen, she has decent HP. I got scammed into thinking that she would only need to be level 60 initially so that I could get her inherent skill, which is not the case. You have to be level 70, but for her weapon, she has variation. It has 43 energy regen, and of course you want this because you want to get her outro skill as soon as possible. In terms of her echoes, she's on the healing set, but all she really has is attack mains and the energy regen. In terms of her skills though, I have virtually no investment in this character outside of a couple free points that I had, specifically for the Resonance Liberation and the Forte circuit, alongside the inherent skill that gives me an attack increase. I do think at some point it might be worth it for me to get to this so that you could get basically an extra life and you can prolong or make doing fights a little bit easier. However, that's for a later time, especially because you're so limited in how many weekly materials you get. All in all though, she's a very budget character. You don't really have to invest that much into the character. I've seen crazy things like crit chance, crit damage, and attack Verina with a little bit of energy regen. I've seen the build that I have right now, or I've seen people with a similar build to what I have right now, which is higher energy regen. I've also seen people with max attack, though again, I don't really know how impactful healing is although I don't really know how impactful having high attack is, because it's specifically just to try and increase how much healing you do, but healing is not that really important in Wuthering Waves when you get one shot. Anyways, this was the build. On with the video. That's going to be it for this video though, guys. Thank you again for watching. Appreciate all the feedback and all the support that you guys gave me on the channel update video that I did right before this, but it means a lot to see all the comments of those of you guys that were supporting me. I appreciate it. Thanks again for watching though. Make sure to check out the rest of my socials. If you want to talk more about Wuthering Waves or see any of the cooks and the calculations and stuff that I'm doing for the characters, feel free to join the Discord. I'll be answering more questions about Jinhsi or doing more theory crafting with Jinhsi on stream, so make sure to check that out as well. But thanks again for watching, everyone. I appreciate it so much. If you want to comment below about what you think about the teams as well, I would really appreciate it. And getting feedback is super, super helpful when it comes to making these videos and when it comes to theory crafting. Thanks again for watching though. I'll see you all next time. Good night. You made it this far, you might as well click on the next one, which I think YouTube would really like. You should do that. I think they would appreciate it if you click on it. I would appreciate it too. Thanks again for watching. I love Jinhsi and Changli equally. Goodbye. Goodbye, everyone. Sorry, I hiccuped.